Hello, 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 hello. Quiet down. Okay. Thanks everyone showing up. We're going to get started with 2 lightning talks we have first. First up is Nate talking to us about EDX and deploying it with Ansible.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So my name is Nate Aune. I recently moved here from Boston. I'm living in Berkeley now. And I run a consulting shop called Jazzcarta, and we work with a lot of universities, helping them with their websites, their web applications. And recently, we've gotten into this new software. It's Django-based. It's called edX. And edX uses Ansible, which is why I'm here tonight, to give you guys a little bit of taste of how Ansible is being used for real-world deployments. So what is edX? It's an online learning platform, also known as a MOOC, Massive Open Online Course. Some of the competitors you may have heard of is like Coursera and Udacity. But unlike those for-profit companies, edX is a nonprofit foundation. It was started by Harvard and MIT. And as of June, they open sourced all the code up to GitHub. So if you have a need for an online learning platform for your university or your nonprofit or your company, it's definitely worth checking out. So edX has attracted over 1 million students from every country in the world who are taking around 126 different courses and counting in just about every subject you can think of from 30 of the top universities around the world. And just to give you a flavor for what types of courses you can take, this is one on science and cooking from top chefs and Harvard researchers. This is autonomous mobile robots, data analysis for genomics. And these are all free. So you can take these courses online you're actually taking the classes from MIT, Harvard professors. So really high quality courses and great content. So this talk is about Ansible. So I want to give you a flavor of how a Django site that serves 1 million students is set up. So there's basically two main components to edX. There's the LMS, which is the learning management system. That's what you as a student see when you go to edX.org. And then there's the CMS, which is also called Studio, and that's the authoring environment. So if I as a professor want to create a new course, I would go to Studio and log in, and I could author my course all through the web. So the LMS stores its course content in Mongo, and then it interfaces with graders. So it does like peer grading and automated grading, YouTube, and a whole bunch of other external services. The stack is Nginx, jQuery, Mako for templating, which is a little bit unusual because it's Django. It's not using Django templates. And then it uses both MySQL and Mongo as data stores. And where it gets really interesting is when you start seeing how all these different services start interacting with each other. So you have a bunch of different types of users that are talking to the analysis system, the LMS, the CMS, and then you have all these sort of base server-side services that have to be running and talking to a whole range of different external services. So you can imagine this is quite a complicated system that takes a lot of effort to configure. And when edX started looking at how to deploy this, they were using Puppet. And they found that Puppet had some issues just around how to predict what was going to happen, and so they started looking for something more declarative. And that's when they came across Ansible. So what were the needs? They needed to be able to quickly provision new developer environments for people, get them up to speed really quickly. They needed a tool to provision resources for their staging, their testing, and their production environments. And they need to be able to configure these things and keep them up to date as things changed. So Ansible was the answer. Ansible configures all these servers so they can run the edX services. And Ansible is also used with Vagrant. So the same scripts can be used to spin up new developer instances that are used to deploy production code up to the EC2 instances. And then Amazon has their whole alphabet soup of different services that's being used. So CloudFormation is used sort of the initial run to get the EC2 servers set up, the RDS instances, the load balancers, Elastic Cache. And Ansible can work with all of these services on the back end. So just going to jump in and show you guys a little bit of code so you can see what it looks like. And Matt's going to give you guys a much better intro than I'm going to. So if some of this stuff doesn't make sense, Matt's going to explain everything. OK, so we're looking at the edX configuration repository, which has all of what Ansible calls a playbook. So you can see in here, for the playbooks, there's a directory called roles. And inside roles, you have a whole bunch of different roles, which are basically what edX uses, or sorry, what Ansible uses to define a service. So if we look in the edX app role, this is the one that handles the actual Django application. So in here we have a bunch of different defaults that can get defined, like what's the MySQL host and port, what do we use for the email backend, what's the memcache directory or URL. So this is where you would define sort of all the constants that you want to get injected into your Django settings file. And then over here we have the main. So one thing you should know about Ansible is it uses YAML files. So unlike Chef and Puppet, like Chef uses Ruby code and Puppet has its own declarative language, Ansible just uses YAML. So it's really, really simple. You can't shoot yourself in the foot because you can't. Oh, I have 1 minute left. OK. So this is basically an example of a file that is restarting the application. It's doing a whole bunch of stuff. And this is the deploy script, which checks out the code, checks out the theme. And you can see it's pretty easy to read. It takes a little while to kind of wrap your head around the fact that you're using YAML to describe functionality to happen, but it works. And these are all the different configuration files that are using Jinja 2. So Ansible will use these templates and then substitute the values that you specified in the defaults file. OK, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to jump back here. And if you would like more information about edX, you can go to code.edx.org, which has a link to all the different repositories that edX uses. As I mentioned, the code is up on GitHub. That configuration repo that has all the Ansible scripts, the CloudFormation templates is there. There's a mailing list, there's documentation, and there's an IRC channel. And I think with that, thank you for your attention.
Okay, next up, we're going to have Scott talk to us about OpenCV in Python.
This is just a quick project that I did using OpenCV, which if you're not familiar with the library, it was written in C++, but as of late it has Python bindings that are pretty nice. So before I say anything, if you want access to the source code, if you just text OpenCV to this number here, that's my GitHub repository, and if you just download that and download the dependencies associated with it, you can build a training set and get started in pretty much under 5 minutes. So basically the context behind what I was doing here is at work we were trying to identify like one person and match it to who we thought that person was. But like Facebook's API, for instance, didn't really return any personally identifiable information. So I suggested like, hey, have we thought about facial recognition? And the guy I was suggesting this to laughed at me. So naturally, I kept going with it. So if you're not familiar with OpenCV, here's just some of the out-of-the-box features here. The one I was concerned about specifically was facial recognition. So first, in order to recognize faces, you first have to be able to detect faces within an image. So that's basically done. It's already pretty much taken care of if you use the OpenCV library. This is just basically an algorithm in which there's already a training set built that's already available on the internet, in which you have negative images, which are images with no faces, and you have images with faces. If you use that previous repo, then this is already taken care of for you. So with facial recognition itself, there's 3 main algorithms that are already packaged up for you within the OpenCV library. To be honest, I really don't understand all of them entirely. I only kind of understand like a surface level of what's going on, but that's kind of the beauty of packages. So to give a brief overview of what's going on, so each algorithm requires a training set. So Fisher faces is actually like the most ideal. So that's basically the algorithm which will provide the best match for you. The downside of it is you need different what's called classes, which is in this case means like you need different individuals, and it's going to match to the like appropriate individual or make the best heuristic in that case. Eigenfaces uses a very similar algorithm, but you don't necessarily need multiple classes. So that's one advantage of it. Local binary pattern histograms, that's actually what I use in this case. It's less accurate than the other algorithms, but it's also drastically faster, and you can actually update the training set on the fly. So you don't need to retrain your algorithm anytime you add a new face to it. So to build a training set, what I just did is I used what's already freely available on Facebook. So the idea here is that like everyone's already done the work for you. They've tagged faces. So in this case, like on an example face, that's me, you can tag the image and tag Scott Lobdell, and then in the API, when you make a call to this photo, it has like the tag information, which this is a totally separate picture. That's not Tim Snyder, just so you know. So this right here is just basically like the heart of the code that I have. Or this is the heart of like the face detection here. So this code's pretty self-explanatory, but I kind of mixed it with the Facebook API. So the Facebook API returns the X and Y coordinates of a face. So what I did is I did face detection on an image, and then I looked specifically at the X and Y coordinates that Facebook gave us. And I said, if that face is in the XY coordinates that Facebook returned, so basically, if it's in the bounds, then I can assume, like, yes, this is the correct person that we're looking at. Because usually, if I want to build a training set for myself, Scott Lobdell, I'm going to be in a bunch of pictures with, like, 3 and 4 other people. So if Scott Lobdell is tagged in a place and there's a face there, it's probably Scott Lobdell. That was the assumption we made. So in a fully automated fashion, here's the results just on, like, my Facebook page. Just ran the script, and I don't know how long it took, not that long. But anyway, builds this training set. So this is just me. In a lot of cases, it actually built like hundreds and hundreds of images, depending on the person. So the algorithm I was trying to accomplish was, like, given an input image, we want to know, is this guy the guy that we think it is, Scott Lobdell? So that's me. And so what I did here is, like, out of the box, OpenCV doesn't, like, readily support this. So I kind of just took advantage of the bounds of the problem that we were trying to solve to actually answer this question. So, like, what I did is I built 3 different training sets instead of just one. And so the idea is that, like, this ID here represents a person. So in this case, like, Scott Lobdell, Scott Lobdell, Scott Lobdell, all these are like different people. So in that way, if the algorithm matches effectively like 3 different times, you can safely assume that's the person. So basically, yeah, what I just explained, those are the random other people. So basically, we take an input image, and it matches all 3 times to the exact same person. And it's the individual we know, we can pretty much trust the algorithm. Otherwise, if it's not, then it's guaranteed, like, that's not a match. So it's actually impossible to match the wrong algorithm using this, wrong person using this case, because we have different faces in each training set. And then in this case, like, this would be like a near match, but it's not. So in this case, we have no like mismatches. We have very few false positives, which can happen as well. And in that case, that's usually either a result of, like, bad data. So in this case, someone tagged himself as his baby. How could he? And then in other cases, like, people just look fairly similar. So this was the heart of the facial matching algorithm. You see, just with OpenCV, here's how to create a face recognizer using the out-of-the-box features here. And then this is just, I kind of abstracted away the logic here, but basically you just attach known faces to, like, an ID, and then you build the training set, and then you just match or then you predict using another face that you have using normalized data. So the results I had with the numbers that I plugged in, I got about 30% matches, which for the needs that I was trying to accomplish worked pretty well, and only about 3% false positives, so that was acceptable. And then 67% just complete miss. These ranges could be adjusted if you do things like change the threshold for the confidence interval, or if you adjust, like with what I did, adjust the number of images in the training set, or adjust the number of training sets, depending on like what you're actually trying to accomplish. So you can basically up both the matches and the false positives at the same time, but those two are tightly correlated. Excuse me. So that's pretty much all. If you want to, here's my information, and that's pretty much all. So, yeah. Oh, no, so I use LBPH, and the reason was just because if, like Fisher faces, if time wasn't a constraint, then that would have given better results. But because like I wanted to do this in like a reasonable amount of time, then LBPH was the one to use. So, yeah.
What's a reasonable amount of time?
Like a few seconds. So basically, like I was using training sets. The training sets I was using were like 10 to 15 people. And if you use like Fisher faces or eigenfaces, that would take several minutes to complete. If I try to do a training set of like hundreds of people, like in the case that I have, like I let it run for 24 hours and it didn't finish. So that wasn't, I mean, for building a training set like that, I didn't do it. One thing that I want to do is I really want to build a training set of people walking into the office, then like theme music played depending on the person. That's the end game of this whole thing, but a little short on time. So, cool.
While Matt's setting up here, I'm going to let Hai from the Python group give an announcement.
Jokes.
Okay, so we'll see. I don't have any jokes prepared. I have a few old ones, but it's okay. So I first just want to give an announcement. The SF Python meetup in this very space in 2 weeks on January 29th, we're having a project night. It's really fun. People just come, groups like the Twisted Matrix people come and just work on their project together. People give tutorials on test-driven development. People come just to learn Python and get an install disk and get it set up. So please sign up, SF Python Meetup, January 29th. You can find us on meetup.com or sfpython.org. And so come hack with us at Yelp. We probably have room for 200 or more people here. Thank you.
Okay, looks like Matt's ready to go. He's going to be talking to us about Django and deploying with Ansible.
Cool. Thanks, Rudy. All right, well, thank you guys for coming out tonight. So this is Django Deployments with Ansible. My name is Matt Makai. I am a developer evangelist for Twilio. I normally live in Washington, D.C., but I'm out here for a couple weeks at Twilio headquarters. And we actually have one person from the Ansible company out here. Tim, if you would just sort of, oh, there he is. Raise your hand. I actually also have a few T-shirts that Ansible sent me, so I'll tell you how to get them in a minute. But if you want more swag, go talk to Tim after this is over. So I am trying something new in 2014, getting my presentation pointer to work, and okay. Let's see here. Sorry about that, guys. Not hooked in.
Press 1.
Yep. There we go. All right. So I'm trying something new in 2014. I created a little app. It's called Text to React. It's on GitHub. And basically, at any point in the presentation, if you guys have questions, it's a large group. If you don't want to necessarily speak up and ask a question or sort of derail the conversation. I mean, if you guys want to ask questions, you're not going to interrupt the flow. Just please ask them whenever you have them. But if you instead want to just text a question or you have feedback or a comment, I just have this number, and this basically just goes directly to me, and I'll get your text message. If you just include your Twitter handle or something, I can get back to you directly with an answer. So 202-999-3940. All right, so I want to take you back in the day, back when I was like starting my career as a developer. I was in a fairly large enterprise environment. This is back when the mortgage industry was just like booming, and there's just tons of money being thrown around. And I worked for a financial institution, and they wanted to really control the way they were doing deployments. So the way that they did this was you would fill out a Word document with absolutely everything that you wanted. Like before you built the application, right? You just fill out, how many CPUs do you need, how much RAM, how much disk space, what are you going to need for the next 5 years? You don't even have the requirements yet. But this was sort of like their way of controlling the environment. And so you take this Word document, take it over to the sysadmin. He looked something like this. And you're like, hey, this is what I need. These are my best guesses for what I need. And so you're working with it, and you're like, you suddenly discover, well, there's a bug in production, and you're going through your code. You're up till 3 o'clock in the morning. And what you realize is when everything was fine in the test environment, it is not the same environment in production. And that is because a lot of times the environments were configured by hand. Somehow configuring servers by hand, installing the packages by hand was the most controlled way of doing the deployment. So that seemed kind of crazy to me, but I didn't know a better way until I got to my second job. And so when I was asked about if I would create some bash scripts so we could have a better control over the deployment process, that's what we went to. I said, wow, these bash scripts are great. They start out like this. So you're pretty clear with what you have in there. Bash isn't necessarily the most easy thing to read, but if you have some comments in there, you just sort of, you write it in a way that you hope that other people will be able to understand it after you leave the project. Oftentimes that doesn't necessarily happen. People are changing them. But these things are very brittle. So you always feel like when you're reading these scripts, there's sort of like this catastrophe waiting to happen. It's like it's just going to hit your project at some point. You're going to be going through the middle of a deployment, and then all of a sudden, boom, everything blows up, and you're like, oh, not only do I have to figure out what went wrong with that deployment, I have to figure out what went wrong with the deployment bash scripts. This is just kind of a nightmare. So again, not a controlled way of doing deployments. So then, as a Python developer, I found Fabric, and I was like, this is amazing. I can pretty much just do what I did in bash scripts, but I can do it like sort of with Python wrappers. So it's a little bit cleaner, right? And then I can write like my Python comments and whatnot. So I actually started using it for ad hoc commands. Okay, I want to rebuild my database. I want to do ad hoc things that maybe are a few steps, and I just want to automate the process. Well, then I went a little bit overboard, and I actually started like building entire servers like this. So this is a script that I wrote. Like this is the gist that I took, where like you activate the virtual env, and then you like install the packages, and it has to be a specific version of Ubuntu. But man, this thing worked. Like it was a lot of code, but it worked. And for a time, like things were good. And then as your servers evolve, and in a production environment where you've got more than a couple servers, you suddenly realize like this is not a scalable, sustainable situation. So you could use something like Puppet or Chef or SaltStack, but I came across Ansible, and I tried to use some of the other solutions, and I found they were just a little bit too difficult for my needs. I knew sort of what I needed. And so what I figured is just for a minute, we would step back and we would think about, well, what do we kind of like need generally from a deployment perspective, right? I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that needs to happen during our deployment process. So when we think about this, there's a bunch of stuff. We need to do server provisioning. Nowadays, we can provision thousands of servers through a cloud infrastructure, so we really need to think about, well, how are we spinning up these servers, then how are we configuring them? So there's a whole thought process into even just the initial setup. Are we going to have Are we going to have images of machines? Like if we're working on Amazon Web Services, we can stamp a new image every time we make a change to a machine. Or are we actually going to go and download packages? There's all sorts of stuff that we need to think about behind this. So that's one thing in the thought process. And then really the next step is, for us, we're working with a Python environment, right? So we're thinking about how do we get pip installed? How do we do virtual M to isolate our dependencies before we even get to deploy the code. So we're basically setting up the servers themselves, and then if we're just doing Django, sure, we're setting up the Python environment, but maybe we also are running Ruby at the same time, so we need to think about the Ruby environment. And then we actually go ahead and deploy our code. And then we're thinking about, well, what are the connections to the database? And embedded in all these different steps, we're thinking about the security process and how to do this in a repeatable way. So the way that I see it is these are sort of the steps that we go through, not only when we do our initial deployment, but as we're going through and we're doing deployments over and over again. And then there are things that just happen to come up. We have these ad hoc things that we want to work on. We want to check out the logs, or we want to see, what's going on, what's the CPU utilization. Maybe we're using some sort of monitoring software to check that out, but maybe we want to just go on to a certain group of servers and see that for ourselves. So we're going to perform ad hoc tasks. And we don't want to do that by just connecting, SSHing ourselves into the remote boxes. Hopefully we can just do that from a command line, and we can do it over a bunch of different servers all at once, so we're not wasting time logging into individual machines. So those are some of the steps that I'm thinking about when I'm just generally doing the deployment process. And so when I came across Ansible, I had already worked with Puppet, and I've played around with Chef, and I, of course, have done a bunch of Fabric. Now, I want to make sure that I let you guys get the most out of this talk as possible. How many of you guys are using Ansible in production today, by a show of hands? Okay, so we've got like three. Okay, we've got a show. All right, so about 9, 10 people. That's pretty good. And we'd love to talk to you guys afterwards about what problems you've come up with. I'll try to highlight later what some of the issues that a lot of my friends who've used this extensively in a production environment, some of the downsides. But certainly everyone has their own war stories. How many of you guys have just played around with it? Just use it for side projects or? Okay, that's pretty good. And then I'm assuming everyone else has. Just show of hands if you've never used Ansible and you really need an introduction. Okay, great. So the mindset I had when I created this presentation was, I learned Ansible really not that, maybe 6 months ago. So I'm by no means an expert. I thought, what are all the things I wish that I knew when I was learning Ansible? I wish someone would just sit down with me for just an hour, a couple hours, and just explain this to me. So that's what a lot of this presentation, the next part of the content, is going to be. So hopefully you guys get a lot out of this, and you come out of here thinking, wow, okay, this is pretty easy. I kind of understand the fundamentals. I'm going to go play with this. And then for you guys who are already using it in production, I'll try to highlight some things as we go along, and then also at the end, for everyone, I have a bunch of references and resources that I think are the best articles that were the aha moments for me when I was like, oh, okay, that's how I do X in Ansible. That's how I should upload my public-private keys. Okay, I get that. So that's some of the resources at the end. And this presentation is online. I'll post the link to it on the meetup page. Okay, so Ansible Works is the company behind Ansible. I actually don't know the exact funding numbers, but I know there was probably a series. I think it was a Series A round, about $6 million. So there's a company behind this open source project. Ansible itself is an open source project. GitHub.com/Ansible/Ansible. There it is, right in front of you. It's built in Python. You can read the source code for yourself. And then Ansible Works builds essentially enterprise products on top of it. But I've never myself used AWX, which is the enterprise product. So you don't have to worry about purchasing an enterprise license to do anything that I'm going to show in this presentation. Okay, so what is Ansible, right? So what I really like about it is it clearly lays out what it is. And when I read some of the other frameworks or some of the other configuration management tools, I was a little bit unclear about. They seem to be like everything to everybody, but this definition, these 4 things that it clearly lays out, I was like, okay, that makes sense. I like that they're thinking about the problem from this perspective because it really maps back to what we just talked about with the deployment steps. So the first thing is a multi-node orchestration framework. I first read this, I'm thinking, great, it works on multiple servers. But that's actually really not what it means. I mean, yes, it works on multiple servers, but what they're really talking about is that there's multiple roles to each server. So you're going to have a cluster of web servers. You're going to have a cluster. You may have a cluster or a single large database instance. But you're also probably going to have Redis instances and all sorts of different things. And maybe you even have overlapping roles. A lot of times you're going to have a security profile. So you can think about each of your servers as being a combination of a bunch of different roles. And that's really what this multi-node orchestration framework is about. So you have a web server. The web server is also a secured server. It may also be running a Redis instance on it. And so it's all of those things put together, but you want the granularity of just going out and querying just the web servers. You don't want to worry about the web servers plus the Redis instances, okay? So that's really what they're talking about when they talk about multi-node framework. Second thing is just configuration management tool. Then also it does application deployment. So they're really thinking about that they understand that you're getting a server into a specific state, and then you're also deploying your code to it. And then you're also performing ad hoc tasks. So there are multiple things that you're going to need to do when you're handling the entire life cycle of your application and the servers that you're using to deploy that application. So the technology behind Ansible, as Nate said, there's a lot of YAML, which at first I'm sort of indifferent about yet another markup language. Key value pairs. I didn't think it was anything really great. In this case, I think it actually works really well, particularly compared to like writing in a domain-specific language. It was super easy to pick up just the YAML. I'd seen it in enough places. I hadn't used it in other applications or other frameworks, but it's easy enough to pick up and understand sort of the key value pair mappings. Jinja 2 templates. So how many of you guys are using like Flask for web applications or Pelican to generate static sites? Like, show of hands. Okay, a decent number. I use Pelican for generating static sites a lot. In fact, all the websites I have are Pelican open source on GitHub, and so that's how I learned Jinja 2 templating. But really, it was like not a learning curve because most of you guys are, if you come in a Django meetup, you're either learning Django or you've been using Django for a while, and it's roughly the same thing. I usually keep the Jinja 2 docs open, but for the most part, a lot of it's the same as using the Django template language. So that's like a win right there. It's like, okay, cool. You're already using something, you're leveraging something that I already know how to use. Everything works over SSH, which is a bit different from some of the other frameworks. In fact, some of the other frameworks, particularly Puppet, are trying to move to this model. There's a couple key wins here. Number one, the other model is you have a master node, and then you have a bunch of slaves, or you have the Puppet master, and then the rest of them are puppets. Now you have agents running on each of your servers. From a security standpoint, a lot of security folks are just very concerned about that arrangement. They're like, well, what if the agent gets hijacked, or what's this other protocol we need to worry about? So that's why I really like the fact that it only runs over SSH, because essentially that means that, okay, we've already got SSH installed and we've already set up our public-private key infrastructure. That's sort of a solved problem. And the reason why Ansible uses just SSH as opposed to, having a puppet slave situation, a master slave situation, is because no one had really tested whether SSH could scale to thousands or tens of thousands of servers. And so Michael DeHaan, who's the co-founder, CTO and primary author of Ansible, basically had worked at, I believe it was Puppet Labs, and said that he started testing and playing around with SSH, and that assumption that SSH was not going to scale, it was unfounded. And so he was able to work and optimize it so that it actually would all run over SSH. So I highlight that because in a lot of environments where there's security restrictions, I know in particular in DC, I used to be a consultant, and we'd run into this a lot, where there was just a ton of situations where the security team's like, no, we're not running an agent on all of our servers. That's a security nightmare. So that really helps. Okay, so a couple things. Number one is the Ansible module library. This is where essentially all the modules work, and I'm going to go into this in a minute. And in particular, there is a module for the Django framework. So all the manage.py commands are like really easy to use. And so we're going to go into this actually just in a moment. Okay, so there you go through the documentation. There's a list of the module index, so you sort of dive in. So let's say we dive into the third from the bottom is system modules. So anything to do with modifying the system. Now we have the user module. Okay, this is the user module in the system class of modules. Basically says, okay, if we want to create a new user or we want to remove a user, we basically use this module. And the way that we use it, we can use it in one of two ways. And the documentation talks about, what are the things that we need to have, the optional and non-optional arguments in order to run this command. There's two ways to use it. One is we can just run it in an ad hoc way from the command line. We can say Ansible, and we're just invoking Ansible. And then web servers, if we do web servers, we're just going to have everything that's designated under web servers, and you'll see this, everything is designated under the hosts file, or there's a couple other ways to specify it if you're not, if you're working with like a cloud infrastructure like Amazon. But you're specifying all the web servers. We want to run the user module, so we're passing the argument M for user, and then we're passing -A for arguments. Name is equal to Sam. We're going to create a new user, Sanfran, or we're going to just make sure if the user already exists that it's on the system. So the state is equal to present. We want that to be there. So if it's already there, great, that's fine. If it's not there, we're going to create it. Then you can set some optional arguments if you want. User ID 1040. We're going to set the group to be meetup. And then we're going to specify, I don't want to run this. If you don't specify the user you want to run it as, it'll use your local user. So like I log in as Matt, and I don't want to connect to all my remote machines as Matt. I want to connect to them as deployer. So I'll just specify deployer. And then this is going to go out to all the web servers over SSH and make sure that Sanfran user exists. So one way of running an ad hoc command. The second way is through a playbook, and this is what we're going to go into. This is sort of like the meat and potatoes of using Ansible. We're going to write a playbook that uses the user module, that leverages this user module, and the way we do this is with YAML. So we're going to write the name of what we're doing here. Now what I really like about Ansible in the way that it's sort of self-documenting is that the name of what you're writing, the way that you're using this module, is like the self-documentation. Ensure the user Sanfran exists. That's like the name of what we're creating here. So when you're running it through the command line, you see, okay, just create this user and ensure this user Sanfran exists. It makes sense. So you really find that like with Ansible scripts, you don't write a lot of documentation, which I really like because documentation generally falls out of date. Yep.
So name being this, how much of that is convention and how much of that is actually you have to use specific words in the name?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you don't need to use specific words in the name. You could like completely write something that does not at all relate to what you're about to execute with the user module. You could say the opposite. It really doesn't matter. In fact, name is optional. That's something to know, but it's really, really discouraged. And I've found like getting back to shell scripts, right? They're really brittle because they're not self-documenting. Name is generally a self-documenting thing that you see in Ansible scripts. You know, and you can immediately understand what each part of the playbook is doing with each module because it's written right there before you actually use it. So same thing that we were doing before with the user module, ensuring that Sanfran exists. Yeah.
Is name used elsewhere in Ansible, like in console output or something like that?
So the question is name used elsewhere in like the console output? So it's used when you're running the script, and then it will. So name is obviously the key, and then the value. It'll display the value when it's running through the script. So if you have, and this is what we'll see in a minute, if you have 10 things that are in your playbook, then when it finishes, or when actually I believe I'd have to double check whether it's when it's running it or when it finishes, but it'll actually display it out to you so you know what's going on. And that what's great about that is like you wrote that name, so chances are it's more descriptive to you as like what's going on in the script itself. Any other questions about that? Yes.
Is there any way to refer to a, I don't know what it's called, a playbook or a script other than by its name, just because it's verbose?
Okay, so is there any other way to refer to the module or the playbook because it's verbose? Okay, so the name itself, I agree, is a verbose name. The only time you would ever refer to this name here when you're using Ansible is if you want to run that you want to start your script from, or you want to start running the playbook from that specific part of the playbook. Otherwise, you would not use, you wouldn't even need to worry about what the name is. It's really just like you can almost think of name in the majority of the cases as being like echo. It's like it's echoing it out to the terminal. Hey, here's what I'm doing right now. And so otherwise, you wouldn't need to specify it. Cool. Okay, so what I figured we would do is I put an example playbook on GitHub. I deliberately kept this as simple as possible while still having enough so that you guys can sort of sink your teeth into like, well, what's a full Django deployment? Like if I create my initial Django app, right, and I'm going to try to scale it to like, you know, a couple servers, but they're beefy servers, a database and a web server, then like, what's a script that I could pretty much use and maybe modify a little bit on my own? So we're going to just quickly walk through what this looks like, just so you guys can get an understanding of, I think Nate actually also did this with his presentation. The edX ones are definitely more complicated. This one is going to be simple enough that I just want to point out what some of the conventions are for Ansible, where things should be placed, and roughly what you're looking at when you look at a playbook. Because a lot of times when you're starting, you're just going to be looking at other people's playbooks and like copying and pasting what they're using. So if you guys want to take a look at this after the presentation, I recommend just kind of absorbing as much as possible during the presentation, and then you can take a look through the playbook on your own afterwards. And by all means, shoot me an email, or shoot me a tweet on Twitter or whatever, and ask me questions. Okay, so essentially what we're looking at here is under my GitHub username / Sanfran Django or SF Django. So we've got a few things that are going on here. So I'll just point out the things that are relevant to Ansible in particular. There's two folders that you're almost always going to find, and I was looking for them, and they exist in the edX. So group vars is where your global variables are going to be stored. So when you have that huge long list of YAML key value pairs, that's where a lot of this stuff is going to appear. And you can break it out so it's not just like one big file. You can break it out by the different roles, so it's organized in a way that you can understand. The second folder is roles, and roles is basically all of the ways that you're using the YAML template. You're using the writing the YAML for the modules, and then it also keeps templates. So like one of the use cases I'm thinking about when I wrote my first Ansible playbook, I'm thinking, well, okay, I want to start up Nginx, but I want Nginx to be configured with a green unicorn backend so that I can work with my Django app, and I just want to do basically like the equivalent of like a port forward to it, right? So with the templates, that's where the Jinja 2 templates come in, and you can basically just have your variables just be plopped into an existing script so that it can be, and then that can be customized based on which, if you have one type of web server or a second type of web server, it can be customized to that. Okay, so those are the two folders to take a look at. I have under here, I have a third folder. This is fairly common as well. There's no standardization of what it's called. SSHconf, I have a known hosts in here. Basically, the known host is for GitHub. So when I'm pulling my code down, the script doesn't hang when I say, git clone that repo. It already knows. I'll copy that known host over to each server that needs to pull down the code, so that it doesn't say, well, this isn't, I don't know what the signature of this host is. So you might see that. It might be called something else, but it'll have something to do with like SSH. Okay, and then the two files that you're gonna see here are the Django Stack, and this can be roughly called whatever you want. You're going to call this Ansible. When you call this playbook and you want it to run, you're going to do Ansible-playbook, and then you're going to specify the name of the playbook that you're trying to run. So in this case, it's Django-stack YAML. Now, in some cases, you're going to have a second YAML file. Maybe you have one that you want to run a different type of process, or you want to have a bunch of ad hoc commands that are in a separate playbook just for convenience sake. You can just have a bunch of different YAML files. But you're essentially going to have a main YAML file that kicks off your playbook. And then the other thing is the hosts. So actually, let's just take a look real quick at what Django Stack looks like, so you guys can get a feel for it. So there's really just 3 roles in this entire repository. We have a common configuration, which is basically like, I'm going to install fail to ban on every single server because I don't want login attempts against the server. I want to make sure it's secured. So you can put like common security configurations in common. That'll be applied to everything. And then roles, so there's a database server and then web server. And then we would have a hosts file. And the host is essentially specifying like which are the web servers and which are the database servers. And then you can just list, okay, what do you want your web servers to be, and what do you want your database servers? So this could be a host name, could be IP address. That was the question? Okay. Yeah. So and then there's other ways. It doesn't always necessarily have to be a static host file. There are ways to sort of hook this into into your provisioning, but I really won't go into that in this talk for just because of time. Okay. So just real quick to look into like group vars. There's just 3 files in here. One is for all, and then one is for database servers, and one is for web servers. So it matches what we have in the host file. And then we just have like, what's the port number that we have. Under all, I believe this is my latest. Okay. So this is one that I just wanted to point out because this really confused the heck out of me when I was trying to configure this for Django. I use environment variables. Like I don't have a local settings file. I have just environment variables configured on my server. And I just like couldn't figure out, I'll try to bring this up as much as possible. I couldn't figure out like how to set an arbitrary number of environment variables. So what I have here is actually how it does work. So you have basically like a dictionary, in Python terms, a hash map of your key value pairs of debug is equal to true and your database URL. And then you can just have an arbitrary number of these things. So like you're using the Stripe API or you're using some third-party service, you just continue to put those in there. And then you can use this as input into the templates that you'll see in a second. Okay, so those are the variables. And then just the roles. And I'll try to hurry this up a little bit just because you guys can probably just, you'll kind of figure out as you're looking through this, like, okay, the organization should be relatively straightforward when you're thinking about, web server and database server. Okay, there's 3 things. Handlers. A handler is basically like when you have a notification, right? So the notifications are really useful, for instance, if you have, let's say you're configuring Nginx or Apache, and you write a new configuration file, and then you want to reload that service. So you do a notify, and then the notify, Ansible will handle, you do notify restart Nginx, and then it'll notify this, and it'll look for restart Nginx, service Nginx, and let's restart it. And we're going to do it as we're going to use sudo in order to do that. Okay. This is under tasks is generally where you have like sort of like the meat of everything. And I like to split everything out. This was one thing that I found a little bit confusing. I couldn't figure out how to had everything in one file, and I was like, this is just a lot in a single file. So then I started using the include command, which basically says like include this other file, and then in the order that you want to install everything. So we'll just take a look at one of these things, and what this is doing is essentially we are ensuring that our cache is up to date for aptitude, and then ensuring that these packages are installed here. And then finally, as I was saying, So in this case, I have 2 templates. In some cases, I want to run SSL with Nginx. Other cases, like I just want to throw out a prototype, don't want to worry about it. So I have 2 templates, one of them for SSL and one for no SSL. And when you look at that, this one is just what I want in my Nginx configuration without SSL and then with the particular variables that we're using. Okay, questions on that stuff. I highly encourage you guys to take a look at it. It takes a little while just to sort of like go through the repository, but I wanted to, this is sort of what I was hoping someone would just quickly walk me through, like, why is it organized this way? What's a convention? What's not? So if you have questions on, yeah.
How are you handling some kind of variables that you don't want to put in the repository, for example, passwords?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, passwords are a huge thing. So in that case, there's a couple different ways you can handle it. One is you could do that with environment variables.
Is that how you're handling this?
No, I'm handling it by just, I have a separate variable file. Well, actually, okay, so there's a separate variable file, and then I don't check that into the Git repo, right? So I have a secure location for that. Another way to handle that would be if you only have like 1 or 2 passwords that you're using, you can pass them in through the command line as extra variables, the -e argument. And I really don't recommend that approach, but that, you know, certainly will work for, you know, like a simple application if you have something that's, yeah.
The edX project uses in the group vars directory a secure dir.
Okay.
And then you can specify a secure dir that lives like outside your Git repo. And then there you have all your YAML files with all your key value stores of things, you know, your API keys and things you don't want.
Yeah, okay, so what Nate said is, and I actually did not know about this, so that's awesome to know, is you can specify a secure directory. So if you have a repository that's outside your Git repo, then you can simply specify what's the directory that has the variables that are like the secured ones that you want to use as part of your deployment. Great, thanks Nate. All right, so the rest of this is basically, I just wanted to really quickly touch on a few things that I wish that I knew about variables and roles when I was just starting, and there's still stuff that, you know, each one of us who's even been using the framework for a few months is still learning about it. So just wanted to highlight some of those things. This just goes into the organization that you just showed. I think we did a good enough job on kind of going through what the standard organization is. This is what you'll typically see with most, you'll see at least this with most Ansible repositories that are out there. Okay, so variables. They can have letters, numbers, and underscores, and they have to start with a number. And so something like, you know, port underscore number is a valid variable. Port dash number is not. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're kind of writing your scripts. There is so there's a couple things about environment variables. You can pull environment variables, and I was a little bit confused on this, like, well, hold on, I'm running this script from my host. Are we pulling the environment variables from my host? No, this is Ansible _env is for remote hosts. So when you're on the remote host, if you're like, okay, I've spun up this instance, what is the IP address? You can do Ansible _env dot eth_0.IP address, right? And then you can pull in the IP address. So if you need to collect all the IP addresses from the servers that you've spun up and then put them in another configuration file, you can do that using Ansible, the Ansible environment variables. And then just one other thing to note, I've actually never run into this. Try to keep things as simple as possible, and that's generally the approach with Ansible, but there is a precedence order with how you're using the variables. So anything that is in your templates themselves, like you can specify defaults, like sensible defaults in your templates, and then those are sort of like, you know, the last thing to use if nothing else is available. You can also specify under group vars your typical variable. That's typically where you'd have a lot of your variables specified. And then you can also pass in extra variables on the command line, and those are going to be the ones that sort of override everything else. So if you're interested in that, there's a bunch of documentation that basically talks about the precedence ordering with variables. But I recommend just kind of keeping it simple as possible until it grows too much, and then you may need to take a look at the precedence. Okay, roles. So the roles basically are what enable us, as I explained before, to sort of specify like this is a web server, but it's also a Redis server. So we're kind of having both. So it enables us to basically specify like the behavior of those server types. And so that's where you start to get some of the power of Ansible is combining the different roles that you see, so you want to have, I think this is actually an area where, if you guys start working with Ansible or you guys have been working with Ansible for a while in production, I have not seen anything about what's the proper granularity for different roles. I think that's probably specific to your environment, like how complex your project is. But if you guys have experiences with that, I think it would make an awesome blog post to say, like, here's the level of granularity we use.
So did you say earlier that one physical server can have two different roles? Like I can have my Redis, I can have a Redis instance on a web server, which I might want to do, for like latency purposes, and that's completely okay. Or do I have to combine them into like some?
Yeah. So the question is, can one physical server have multiple roles? And yes, and that's exactly where the power comes in. Is like maybe you have 6 just standard web servers, and then you have a few web servers that have Redis instances as well. So they're both web servers and Redis servers or something like that. Yeah. You can sort of mix and match them. Yeah. Is there an easy way for auto scaling or like? So I unfortunately do not have enough information to really answer that question well. Maybe we can talk afterwards with some of the guys who've used it. I know I've done less with the cloud provisioning. I've used this a lot more for virtual private servers. So I'm not familiar with the scaling up and scaling down of it. Sure. I just don't want to steer you in the wrong direction with that.
So if I'm writing a website and I'm first deploying it on my local Mac machine and then also want to do it on a shared hosting, would I write a separate group varis file for each machine?
The question is, would you write a separate group varis file if you're just like writing it on your local host on your Mac and then you're deploying it to like a Linux server out in the cloud? There's probably going to be some differences, and so with the varis have /users/ your name, and then on Linux it would be /home. So that's where the variables would change. What you can do is you can split out like what are the common variables, and then you can have one that just kind of like overrides either the defaults, or you can have just a separate variables file where the ones that are going to differ between those two environments, you specify one or the other. Okay. So roles basically enable this powerful behavior, and they enable reuse and organization. Okay, so I just wanted to wrap this up with some good examples of code. We kind of walked through the Git repo really quickly, but I took some examples out of that I just wanted to walk through for each one of these things that you see here on the list. So I thought like this presentation had like way too much text in it, so like I drew some pictures for you guys because I don't know, I like pictures, and I like the paper app on iPad, and there's like the new pencil thing out, and I've like just been dying to like try the new pencil, so that's what I drew in these cases. So all right, so for like configuring servers, so like you have your templates, and you have like, the way that I see it is like you got templates, like, so let's say like this is the Nginx package, like blue is package, and then like you've got templates. So you're installing Nginx package, and then you're installing your templates there. So like what's, a decent example of doing something like that? So I actually used Apache in this case. I wanted to use something, so before we saw like you can use aptitude, but you can also use yum. So with yum, you can install Apache in the latest state. And then, okay, well, let's check if like the configuration directory exists. And if it does, then we're going to, so what this means is we're going to check something. We're going to check the, I think stat, I'm actually not sure if that stands for statistic or exactly what that is, but essentially, or what it stands for. But essentially we're saying like, check this path, right? Like, does this path exist? And let's register that as a variable. And then we're going to print out a debug message if it exists. So we're going to say, is the directory defined? And it is a directory. So it's like a file out there, and it's also a directory. Then we're going to print out the debug message. Yes?
So is there a package module, or do you have to say yum or apt-get specifically in the playbook?
You do have to say it specifically. The way I actually really like this from the standpoint that like I unfortunately have not used Puppet enough to really understand the intricacies of that. But when I started using it, they kind of danced around like, okay, well, you know, some packages are named differently in certain places, and I thought the simplest way is just like, okay, I want to use this package manager, and I want this package, and so what this allows is like we can use Aptitude, we can use Yum, we can also use Node Package Manager, pip, like we can use there's modules for all the different package managers. So to do the abstraction of like saying like, I don't care what package manager we're using, like a lot of times it presents a lot of ambiguities. So in this case, yes, we would specify the specific module for that package manager. Yeah.
So that means you'd have to know ahead of time what OS you're running on.
The question is, do you know ahead of time? Yes, you'd have to know ahead of time what operating system.
Could you specify some abstraction thing that would tell it, detect the OS and then run this one?
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly, you can definitely, like, pull an environment variable or know ahead of time, like, okay, here are the CentOS servers that I'm running, here are the Ubuntu servers, and we're just going to handle those things differently. Or you could do it in a script, so you could have like a variable there that's going to like check the environment, or you can just have a different role for that server. Yes.
So what I've done in the past is just use the plan, and you actually have a different task that executes depending on which kind of server it is. And the plan is just going off of something that will tell me, you know, uname-a or whatever that gives me enough information to go, oh, when the result of that equals this, use Yum, use apt, use whatever.
Yeah, so you can inline as you can in the YAML itself have, you know, basically the if-then statements. They're called when statements in Ansible, depending on the distro, and then that'll determine the package manager that you're going to use. Okay, so we want to, like, we've kind of gotten all these packages and templates on there, so now we want to set up like our Python environment. So how do we do that? So we would first check if the virtual environment already exists. So that's something. The first time you're going to do your deployment, maybe you want to just, you know, stand up a virtual environment. So we're going to check to see if it exists, and we're going to create it if it does not exist, right? So when it does not exist, when that directory is not defined, then let's go ahead and create virtual env. Now, this is something that I wanted to point out. So here I'm using the shell command, and I'm saying just virtual env, create this virtual environment directory, which is a variable. I believe there is also a virtual env module built into Ansible. I actually should have checked right before this, but I believe that there is one where you can just specify, for example, virtual env and then virtual env directory. So that's something that, you know, in some cases, if there's not a module already written, you can just use shell, or there's another thing called command where you can basically drop down and do command line. Yes?
Wouldn't you also, maybe I'm misremembering, but I think there's a way for in shell and command to say only run if something doesn't exist, or a better way to put it, after this command is successful, something exists that wouldn't exist before, as a little skip it, rather than doing that first check. You can sort of do it in a more succinct way by putting that extra parameter to shell or command.
Yeah, so the challenge is, what he's saying is basically that you can set a value, you can register a value like right after that operation is complete. The only challenge is though that if you are rerunning this script, then I would have to see exactly how that variable is being set, but it's possible that value, if it's not set because you're rerunning the script, then would cause it to recreate virtual env.
So what it does is you can just say creates and give the file or the directory.
Yeah.
And then it will look for that before it actually runs the command.
Yep.
And so it'll just make it indefinite that way.
Yeah.
So I don't need to run this. Great. Go to the next thing.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. So in a lot of cases, you can just say like create something, so it knows like, okay, if it's already there, like I don't have to worry about creating it, and if it's not there, it'll go and create it. And that way, you can simplify your script, so you can just kind of remove the first thing. You don't have to have like branching statements. You can just say creates this. Okay, And then in this case, we're using pip as our package manager, and we're just installing the dependencies from the requirements.txt file. Okay, now we want to deploy our code. So just really quick 2 steps here. One is we're going to copy over this known hosts file into the SSH directory for our deploy user. And then we're going to use the Git module in order to check out this code repository, which we've specified in our variables, and we're going to specify a destination for that. So what this is showing is two additional modules. One is just a copy. We're copying from our local machine, which we have in this case we'd have like /conf, and then copying the known host file onto a remote server. And then we're also showing the Git module here to pull down code. Okay, now we have like our code and we've got our environment set up. Now we want to like work with the database in order to get our schema set up and do our migrations. So we can do, this is where I wanted to highlight the Django manage commands. So basically, Django manage is a module in Ansible which allows us to work directly with the Django module, the Django manage.py commands. So in this case, we're going to first do our sync database. We're specifying an app path, and then we're working with a certain virtual environment. And then we're going to pass in these environment variables. Now, one thing to watch out for is if you don't specify all of the environment variables that you need to run, then that's where these things can fail. And the only thing you have to watch out for is if you're not using a verbose way of debugging. So one way to see a verbose output from Ansible is -v, like 4 Vs. You can also do like 3 Vs. That changes the verbosity of the output. Sometimes that can fail if you're not specifying all the environment variables. So that's just one thing to watch out for that's kind of bitten me a couple times. And then we could run our migrate command. And what I'm doing here is I have a value set, Django use south. And if I'm not using south, well, then I don't want to run our migrate command. So therefore, like, we'll just skip this step. Okay. And then the last thing is, we kind of want to check our logs or something like that, or we want to perform some ad hoc commands. And so in this case, just got cut off a little bit. But there's 2 ways we can do this. One is we can do this through a playbook. We could run a module from just the Ansible command, or we can run a specific step from the command line with the Ansible playbook command. And so in this case, we're going to run the Django collect static command to pull all of our static files into a single directory. And we're going to run it with these environment variables. Now we've run this in the command line, Ansible playbook with the Django Stack playbook, and then we're going to specify a specific step. And I apologize for the cutoff, but essentially this would all be one line, and the step would be, so --step indicates that we want to actually step through this. So we want to explicitly say whether we want to run commands or not. So after we've run this one command, we're basically just going to like get out of the script. So, or maybe we want to run some of the other commands after it, and that way we can step through it step by step. There's a really easy way of just running a few select commands in a row. And we're going to start at the Django collect static, which we've named up here, and specify the deploy user. And then one other thing is, if you want to specify a sudo password up front, so it doesn't prompt you, the -K with a capital K is the argument for that. All right, so I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the downsides. This is feedback that I've gotten from people that are using Ansible extensively in production. They've sort of taken a lot of the really great, they enjoy the great parts of it, but they recognize that there are some downsides. So one of the things is that there is no Windows support. You can sort of hack it together with Cygwin and SSH daemon, but unfortunately, like out of the box, there's no Windows support. So you can certainly get it working, but you're going to have to do a lot of hacking in order to do that. And so that's one thing that, the whole point, or one of the points of using Ansible is it's really easy to get started with. If you have a mixed environment of Linux and Windows, that's going to be one more hurdle just to get everything set up. Okay, there's a lack of testing tools. This is something that I think is coming from the community needs to get better at sort of stepping up to the plate and saying, here are some unit testing tools, here are some functional testing tools for our scripts so that we can make sure that everything is working properly. So it's not enough to say, well, it's a really small script, it should work. These scripts grow over time, and we want testing tools that can make sure that we can adequately ensure that everything is working properly. And I think this is an area where it's definitely behind when it comes to some of the other configuration management tools. And then I think there's a little bit of ambiguity around reuse of Ansible. So how do you best share playbooks? How do you best share some of the variables? This is something that is coming along in the community, but is still not entirely there from what are the conventions and the standards that the community uses in order to facilitate reuse. So just something to think about. Also opportunities if you start really using Ansible on a large scale to solve some of these problems for the greater community and become one of the companies that really says, yeah, we solve these problems in the Ansible community. Okay, just wanted to wrap up with one of the things that I was sort of writing a lot of Ansible, and I'm like, this would be my dream, right? I'm writing all these scripts, and so some of these are pretty simple projects. So my dream would be you do a pip install of a deployment tool. You're using Django, so you're like, all right, I'm going to add this to my installed apps, deploy tool, and then I'm going to modify, all right, what are the deployment parameters? Where do I want to deploy this, and what do I want to call it, and whatnot? And then Python manage.py deploy, and then it's whoosh, just as easy as if I was using Heroku or something like that. So I thought through this a lot, and I was like, it seems like it should be close to possible with Ansible. And so that's when I came out with, I wrote this open source project when I had some free time over the holidays, and I called it Underwear. And if any of you guys read Python Weekly, it was just in Python Weekly. But this is the project that it works right now. You can deploy to a single server, a couple different servers, web server, and a database server on the back end. What I want this to be is essentially there's no question if you're starting a new project, you want to just throw it out on the internet. You've got a server, just sitting in your closet, or you want to spin up a virtual private server. This should just do it for you, right? You should be able to write. You should just be able to do those 4 things, and you're good to go. And it's getting closer. There's just a couple extra steps. I think it'll actually stay like this. You're going to get, I think it's best to split out what are the variables and then the hosts so that you can specify those separately. And you modify those things, and then you do Python manage.py deploy. So if you guys are interested in just kind of standing up some servers and whatnot, it's called Underwear. It's pip install Underwear. And the great part about this is that it uses Ansible under the covers. So if you're wondering about well, how should I write my Ansible scripts? I'm trying to incorporate as many of the best practices as possible in this project. So if you search on GitHub for Underwear, it's the first thing that pops up. And there's just a ton of Ansible scripts. So you guys can use those as examples in your own project. The idea with this is basically you're using this under the covers of your app. And then when you're kind of done with it, you want to change your deployment process. You can take those Ansible scripts and just modify them for your own project and just kind of keep going with it. Yes? Yeah, the question is about why do Python manage.py deploy? Because that necessitates using it in installed apps. I just like to incorporate it from a Django perspective, like you're going to use migrate from South. Just something that comes naturally, and there's probably going to be a bunch of different commands. It's not just deploy, it's also going to be maybe some separate steps. Let's say you only want to upload your public-private key pair and lock down the server, then there'd be a list of commands, and the Django developers are just used to typing Python manage.py to see what's available to them. And so I thought that was a good hook into Django. But certainly for deploying Flask or Bottle or Pyramid applications, there's going to be a different way of doing that.
Are you actually, so if you use manage, you have access to say Python environment variables and all the internal model stuff, right? Are you using that currently there?
So the question is around, does the project use the environment variables that are set in the settings file? No, it does not. You specify those separately as a part of the underwear.yaml file, but certainly that is something that could potentially be possible. I'd have to sort of think about what the strengths and weaknesses of that. I want this to be something that's generic enough that you can use it with multiple frameworks. So I'd have to think about how that would work. But anyway, I bring this up mainly because if you check out the repo, like a bunch of great Ansible scripts in there. Well, all right, a bunch of Ansible scripts in there. You can decide how good they are. And it's just another example that you probably want to take a look at. So just want to wrap this up with, I will post this presentation to Meetup, the Meetup page. But these are the things that I found the best resources for learning Ansible. I just try to put as many as possible. One of them is there's actually a weekly newsletter that sends out Ansible information, and then these are just a bunch of the things that I thought were interesting. I also this is Reveal.js. If you guys are interested in using it I really like this JavaScript framework for creating presentations. I just have a link to the source code of this presentation if you're interested. That's it. This is my contact information. My name is Matt Makai. I'm on Twitter. I do tweet a lot about Ansible and stuff like that, and Python in general. So I try to keep it just to those topics. But that's myself. So thank you guys for coming. Quick. You want to wrap up or quick questions or? Okay, let's just do a few questions and then we can split up. But go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. Do you know which of the popular infrastructure provisioners like Cobbler, Crowbar, whoever support Ansible, have Ansible providers?
Yeah, I actually do not know the answer to that question. He's asking about Cobbler and Crowbar, and I actually do not know. I don't know the answer to the question about support with Ansible.
There's a Cobbler stuff in the Ansible docs that shows you how to actually integrate with Cobbler.
Okay, great. And I'm sure Tim there would know more. It's kind of like, yeah.
Repeat what he said. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. So that was a question about Cobbler and Crowbar, and they actually do have some integration with that. Yes.
The other big kind of Python configuration management is Salt. Did you kind of think about using Salt? What made you decide to use Ansible? Kind of always been curious myself. What made you choose Ansible?
Sure. So the question is about Salt and Ansible. Both are written in Python, and some of the differences. I did not test Ansible. I did not test Salt for myself. There is a really detailed post, a detailed comparison, Ansible and Salt, that I thought was really interesting, and that if you guys are thinking about one or the other, I think probably the best strategy is to test them out. If you just do a couple projects with them and kind of figure out what the strengths and weaknesses are. But I'm sure there's people. How many of you guys use Salt in the room? Like raise of hands. Okay. So there's a bunch of people that kind of know the Salt world as well that might be worth talking to. Let's do one more question. Let's sort of like break up and we can split up for the evening. Any other questions at this point? Oh, well, I'll do the one in the back.
How much is Ansible and how much is open source? Who actually drives the development?
Sure. So the question is around how much of this is like Ansible, the company, versus what's open source. So everything that I showed here and all the modules are open source, and everything is under Ansible/Ansible on GitHub. What's not open source is a product built on top of, and Tim, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a product built on top of Ansible called AWX, which is like a user interface for handling this stuff through the browser. So if you want to deploy AWX and then you want to handle your configuration through a UI instead of like writing scripts, that's I think really the difference there. But if you're interested in more, Tim's right here, and I'm sure he can answer those questions. So let's actually I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of like just everyone asking questions and keeping everyone. So if you have other questions, just like come up and let's talk about it. And thank you guys all for coming this evening.